Isolation has become a bigger and bigger problem. The way we connect with others and the way we push them away as well. For myself, before I knew I had ADHD, I just thought I was a hermit, a loner. I enjoyed my time alone, but I didn't like to be alone. Or that's what I thought. But it turns out I had a very small group of people, usually one or two, that weren't my family, that I could really be myself around. I'm sure masking is a huge part of why we isolate, but I think it's important for myself and potentially many of us to kind of dig deeper and learn more of why we isolate and how we can change some of those behaviors for the better. So as I'm sure many of you know, we have here Dr. Russell Barkley. I've seen him pop up many times. I've seen one or two videos of his. He's an expert. I'm not sure exactly what his title is, but I believe he specializes in children or young adults with ADHD. But we'll see if he gives us his own introduction. Today we're going to look at Russell's video here on loneliness and ADHD. Kind of perfect for the questions I'm asking. It's a little bit of a longer video, so we'll try to highlight the most important parts and the most relevant parts.
Hey everybody, it's Russ Barkley back again. I am your Boomer Barbie, looking pretty in pink here today. Hope you appreciate it. This is the only channel where you can watch a boomer decay, so let's let the decomposition begin.
Not looking too bad,
Actually,
man.
seriously, in this presentation, I want to talk about the relationship of ADHD to loneliness and social isolation. And the reason I want to discuss this is in my news feed yesterday, there was an article that appeared in the trade media online at the website known as medium.com by Dr. John Cruz that talks about this association of loneliness with ADHD and ADHD with loneliness. There were a few things that were mentioned in this article, however, that I would take issue with. And we'll talk about that later, but essentially it boils down to, we know that ADHD is linked with and probably even causes social isolation as well as the subjective sense of loneliness. But he is arguing that it also goes the other way around, that loneliness, through its reshaping of brain networks over time, might well either lead to ADHD de novo, out of nowhere, or worsen one's ADHD over time. And I don't find that very compelling given the existing literature out there. So let's take a look at this and do a deeper dive.
That's interesting. I mean, there's so many times where we kind of doubt. It's that imposter syndrome, that feeling that we're fakes. But there's times where I'm like, I question, do I have ADHD or am I just stressed or am I just a loner? But I always go back and I do see patterns, which I do understand is a big part of kind of separating the two.
Let's remember that there are different ways of defining loneliness. First of all, there's the objective definition, which really is social isolation. To what extent do you have friends, good friends, and to what extent are your friendships lasting ones? That's more of an objective measure. We can actually go out and count that, measure that, as has been done in children in particular, and define individuals as being socially isolated. On the other hand, loneliness is the subjective sensation of feeling left alone. It's not being alone. There are a lot of times we like to be alone, particularly if you're introverted.
Interesting.
So being alone is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is a subjective state of distress, if you will, or upset, where one feels that one is isolated from others. They wish they had more friends. There's a quality of loneliness where one feels abandoned by their peers and perhaps even family members. So lonely.
I agree. I do think that I don't feel lonely. And I think that's part of the problem. I've had a tendency of pushing people away, either through ghosting or just kind of not allowing myself to unmask fully, whether it was consciously or unconsciously. I'm still not sure.
Peers and perhaps even family members. So loneliness is the subjective side of being socially isolated. Uh, so keep those in mind because we're going to talk about both of those at this time. So now let's point out that over the years, we have seen many studies. Here's one that came from King's College London over on their website, but it's consistent with many, many other studies showing that ADHD is related to both social isolation and feelings of loneliness in childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and even in late life among the elderly. Now, that's a relationship, but research also shows that ADHD over time can lead to social rejection and toward hostility from others, and eventually being socially isolated from them. And of course, leading to that sensation of loneliness as well. So there's a causal connection here, not just a correlation. And then in addition, we know that social isolation in childhood and at later periods in life is linked with not only ADHD, but with other comorbid conditions like depression, anxiety, and so on. So it's not clear in the research at this point whether being socially isolated leads to later problems or is simply a reflection of your ADHD and the various other disorders and mental health problems you might be having at a particular time. So the causal connection here of isolation and loneliness to later problems isn't very clear, and we certainly could use some more. Now, in addition, what is completely unestablished is that social isolation leads to the rewiring of brain networks, which leads to a greater risk for ADHD
That makes
and
sense to
other
me.
disorders. And although that initial article that I mentioned at medium.com tries to make that argument, it's not a very compelling argument.
It's kind of reassuring that it's that I didn't do it to myself. Maybe.
Here we have ADHD, and over here we have loneliness and social isolation. We've already established that ADHD in young children can lead to rejection, a decline in friendships, being friendless, even by second or third grade in over half of the cases of ADHD, and that figure is even higher if there is comorbid oppositional defiant disorder.
Just to kind of add my own thoughts to that. When I think back to a kid, I definitely held friends better, but it was never a group of friends. It was only fifth grade. It was a group of four of us where we were really close. But even then, it was only one of them that, I would go to their house and sleep over and really met their parents and created a longer lasting relationship. But even then, we went to different schools and it was harder to just keep up. So we drifted apart as well. And so when I think through, there's always just been that one person. And when I got into relationships, it's like I only had the energy for one person. So my friends kind of fell to the wayside and my relationships took the priority. And I think that behavior kind of carried on. And as an adult, I did better, but I still didn't really have a close friend, like he mentioned, like a close friend that I could fully unmask with since I was much younger. So to this day, unfortunately, I've had people, great friends, great friends who were willing and open to me. And I did I did want to, and I tried, and I did. I feel like I did, but when everything kind of came crashing down, I completely fell back into that behavior. And to this day, I'm it's as easy as just reaching out. but it's like I don't know what to say, and it's almost like it's easier for me to wait to get better, even though that I know time is the enemy and waiting is the exact opposite of what I should be doing. Let's keep going.
So I think it's pretty clear that ADHD and its primary symptoms of activity, talkativeness, distractibility, and so on can lead others into not liking you, and that can lead to you being rejected or ignored by others, and eventually not only being isolated, but feeling lonely. So I think that's a fairly well established connection over time.
And it's not that people didn't like me. I had plenty of people who would come to me for advice or, to lend a helping hand, but it was me. And I still don't know why.
The research also shows that ADHD, as you well know, is linked to deficits in the major executive functions, and that those deficits, particularly problems with emotional self regulation,
Check out my video on executive function from Dr. Tracy Marks.
are also predictors of loneliness and isolation at currently and going forward over time. Indeed, the single best predictor in research studies of how many friends someone with ADHD is going to have is their degree of poor emotional self regulation, even more than the problems with inattention, hyperactivity, distractibility are these problems with emotion. Other people can
Yeah.
put up with your talkativeness, your sort of fizziness, your activity. What they are less tolerant of is anger, temper, hostility, aggression, and other negative emotions.
That just takes me back to the masking. And in my case, I learned very early that masking, I guess, or being that way, being more of a listener than a talker was better and got better results from people or better reactions from people. And I internalized that so much that it became who I was. And all those emotions that he's talking about, the anger, the frustration, the avoidance of conflicts, the fear of conflict, all of that was just kept inside, and that's what led to the burnout.
That cause them distress and cause them to pull away. So it's not really the traditional ADHD symptoms per se that are linking up with social isolation and loneliness. It's really those problems with emotion
I
regulation
agree.
more than the others. Now, in addition to that, we know that ADHD is associated with a variety of comorbid disorders. That's a relationship. To some extent, ADHD may be causing some of these disorders. We know that ADHD contributes to the development of oppositional defiant disorder, possibly later conduct disorder, feelings of sadness, dysphoria, and possibly even depression, and also problems with anxiety. And the longer ADHD goes untreated, the greater the likelihood that those other problems may develop, and they too have a causal connection to later loneliness and social isolation. So it's a rather complex picture, but this, I think, gives a pretty good
I gotta say,
thumbnail
I'm
overview or
thankful for the
sketch
visual.
of the relationship among these various conditions, ADHD and loneliness and social isolation specifically. Now, back to that article by the good doctor over at medium.com. They or he is trying to argue the reverse direction as well, that loneliness can lead to not only comorbid disorders, I agree with that, possibly depression or low self esteem and
Yeah.
sadness, but he, in addition,
Which I
is
thought was the
arguing
issue
that
during
loneliness
COVID.
through its rewiring of brain networks can lead to a worsening of your ADHD or even cause ADHD where it may not have existed previously, perhaps in cases that were sort of marginal and then become worse and fully clinical ADHD. I'm not so sure about that. He makes this argument on the basis of there's research to show that people who report feeling lonely and being socially isolated do have different patterns of brain activation and functional connectivity in the brain. And some of these areas of the brain overlap with those for ADHD. And so he then goes on to say, see, isolation and loneliness cause these brain-related problems. Those problems can lead to ADHD. Those are pretty big leaps because he's basing this purely on correlational studies. Yes, there are studies showing that people who are socially isolated have different brain networks and connectivity than others. What he doesn't mention, that he should have, is that people who are lonely and socially isolated have a high probability of having disorders like ADHD, autism spectrum, among others,
Yeah,
which
it's an
themselves
underlying issue.
are related to those brain network problems. So it's not the loneliness that's leading to the rewiring of the brain. It's the other conditions that are going along with loneliness that are associated with these underlying brain network problems. It's just a pattern of correlations. And it's likely because the research on loneliness and brain networks did not control for the high probability that people who are lonely, in fact, have a number of mental conditions, particularly ADHD and autism spectrum. And that's where the underlying neural network deficiencies and differences are coming from. So I would take issue with that article on this reverse causation of loneliness to ADHD through rewiring of the brain. Just wanted you to appreciate that in case you came across that article in your own news feed.
I do appreciate that because I could have very well, and many people probably did find that article and may have started doubting themselves like I have in the past for no reason, let alone seeing an article, and we all know that you can't believe everything that's online, but it's human nature, most of us don't read past the headline or the title. All right, Russell. Well, very informative. I'm definitely going to check out more of his longer videos. I know he has some speaking to a crowd or an audience. Not sure if they're lectures or not, but I like his style. He's real and he calls it how it is. And again, it's validating to see someone like him kind of saying, no, it's not your failure of not being able to deal with the symptoms causing the symptoms, if that makes sense. There's a lot that I learned from this video, but I almost have more questions about my specific case where people have always liked me. I've always been very personable, but I had a tendency of isolating myself. And I know that that is an ADHD trait, and it might be a masking issue as well. But I want to dive deeper into the isolation part of this. So if you guys have any videos to suggest that might kind of fill in those gaps or that experience, share down in the comments. Let me know how you deal with isolation or have maybe overcome it. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll be posting 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. Please like the video if you think someone else out there might be experiencing a similar situation. I find that hearing other stories help me, so if I could help someone else, that's why I'm here. Thanks again, everyone. I'll see you next time. Peace.